In this lesson, we'll learn how we can start to use the render stats setting to start to really heavily control the overall rendered appearance of our objects inside of Maya. Okay, so we're going to be working once again with just a really simple scene to sort of show off these render stats and what they're capable of doing. So let's start by just taking this scene and let's just do a quick render. So with this viewport active, let's come up to our little clapboard icon and once again just render this out. We'll give this just a few minutes to complete its render. Now this is going to be rendered with Mental Ray, so it might take just a little bit longer to complete, depending on the overall speed of your computer. And there we go. That's just about finished up. So we have this scene set up, a couple of really simple objects, some nice sort of shadows in here, and let's say we want to start to come in and maybe control some of the overall rendered appearance of some of these objects. So for example, with the render stats, we could take something like this cube, and we could, for example, tell this cube not to be responsible for casting any shadows. So let's just close out of this. Let's go to our cube. We're going to press Control A on our keyboard to open up the attribute editor. And with this cube's shape tab selected, we're going to come down and look for the render stats. So let's open that up. Scroll down just a little bit. You can see that we have several different settings in here that we can start to control. Now all of these are going to be calculated at render time. So for example, let's say we did not want this cube to be able to cast any shadows. Now let's see what that looks like in the render view. Now rather than setting off a whole new render at this point, what I want to do instead is just simply open up the render view. So I'm going to click on this little icon right next to it, and that'll open up the render view without actually setting off a whole new render. Now the reason I want to do that is because before I set off a new render, I actually want to take this image and save that for comparison. So the way that we do that is with this little icon right up here, this keep image icon. So I'm going to click on that, and you can tell now that we have an image store because we have this little scroll bar. This little scroll bar will let us go back and forth between the image we have saved and the current render. Now at this point they're the exact same image, so we don't see any difference. But watch what happens now when I set off a new render. Give this just a second to complete. And I'll actually just take a moment to pause the recording of this while this render finishes up. There we go. And now you can see that we no longer have any shadow from this cube. And now if I go back and forth, I can compare what I had before to what I have now. Okay, very nice. So you can start to see immediately where something like this could be really useful. So we can have a tremendous amount of control over the final result of our image and the final look of all of our objects. Even though something like this may not necessarily be physically accurate, this again may be something where as a lighting artist you may want a very particular look, or you may not want certain shadows or certain objects to be visible in certain ways. And again, if you do this in a way that is tasteful, in a way that is subtle enough, this can still come across as a really good final result. So for example, let's say if we wanted to take this cube, right now we no longer have it set to cast any shadows. We could also maybe set it to not be able to receive any shadows as well. So let's disable that option. Go back to our render view. Once again, I'm just going to take this image at the end, save that for comparison, and let's re-render. Okay, very nice. So we can see now this little corner of the cube is no longer receiving any shadows from any other object, in addition to the fact that it is no longer casting any shadows itself. So we can actually now look at both of our stored images and sort of see where we started off with and what we now have. Now there's lots of different settings that we can start to control in here. For example, let's say maybe this little orange gem that's in here, maybe we don't want this little gem to be visible in certain objects' reflections. So we can go back to this little gem object. Let's click on that. And with its render stats, let's tell this little object to no longer be visible in any other object's reflections. Now let's once again, we can save this image for comparison. Take a quick render. Okay, very nice. So you can now see that this little orange gem is no longer visible in the reflections of this cube as it was before. And also this little orange gem is no longer going to be visible in its own reflections, which that was actually what was responsible for giving it sort of this little deep red color. So the overall visual appearance of this little gem has changed pretty dramatically. But again, we do have that level of control if we ever need it. Now, one of the things that we can actually do while we're inside this render view talking about this is we can navigate inside this render view just like we would any other Maya viewport. So I can press and hold the Alt key on my keyboard, middle click on my mouse to move this image around. I can middle click and left click at the same time to be able to zoom in on certain areas. So that can be useful for kind of getting in a little bit tighter and looking at certain areas. Now if I wanted to get back to 100% zoom, I just click on this little 1-to-1 icon, and there we go. Now we're back to original size. Okay, very nice. Now let's take a look at a few more of these options before we wrap up this lesson. Let's say, for example, this little outer shell. For whatever reason, let's say maybe we did not want this object to be able to cast any shadows. Let's actually switch this up a little bit. Let's say we don't want this object to have any sort of primary visibility. What that means is that this object will essentially no longer be visible to the camera. So just to see what that looks like, again, save this image for comparison. Let's re-render so we can have something to compare that to. The act of saving your images for comparison is really just sort of a personal workflow for me. Not something that you have to do by any means. I just find it really, really useful, a good habit to get into for being able to compare sort of the changes that you made and compare that to what you had before. Okay, now you can see, compared to what we had before, that little outer sort of metallic cage for this little gem is no longer visible to the camera. But if you look closely, you can see that everything else is still visible. So that little metallic cage, even though it's not visible to the camera itself, it does still show up in the reflections of other objects because we do still have that checkbox turned on. So it is still going to show up. You'll notice also that this little metallic cage is still set to cast shadows. So if you look closely, you can actually still see the shadow from that metal arm of the cage that existed previously. So nothing has changed as far as any sort of reflections, any sort of refractions, any shadow contributions. The only difference is the actual geometry itself is no longer visible to the camera. So you can really start to get an idea of just how powerful these render stats are. And they're not necessarily something that you'll use with every scene, but they are definitely something that when the time comes that you will need to use those, you're going to be definitely glad that you have these things at your disposal, because they can be a lifesaver for those handful of situations where you really need them. Okay, so that's a look at the render stats inside of Maya and how we can start to use these to gain a really, really high level of control over our final rendered scenes.